all these settings basically relate to the playback and the viewing of images that you've taken. And you can see you've got a long list of options which you can scroll through. The first one is delete. Obviously that deletes images that you've taken, and you have various options there on them. Display mode, this is basically for when you're watching your images, and you can in the playback on the screen you can have different options, like you can have the highlights flash, you can have an RGB histogram, or you can have data, and you can have different transitions when you go through your photos. Image review is when you've taken a photo, and it instantly pops up on the screen. You can turn that off if you want. I prefer just to leave it on, just so you can quickly have a look at the pictures you've taken. Rotate tool, this means when you take an image in portrait mode, it will kind of flip it round back into landscape. And that's all for the playback menu. Okay, next up we have the shooting menu. Obviously this relates to all the different settings whilst you're actually shooting the camera. First one you have here is reset shooting options. If you press this, that will reset all of the settings that you've made, so only click that if you want to reset the camera back to its default setting. Set picture control. Now these picture controls here are not needed if you shoot in RAW format. I mean, just leave it on whichever one that it's on. But if you shoot JPEG, which most beginners probably are, you've got a lot of different settings here which relate to the sort of the style of the picture, if you like. Standard will just give you kind of a standard image. Neutral will sort of tone all the colours down a little bit so it looks more neutral. Vivid obviously boosts the colours, boosts the saturation, so the picture looks a lot more vivid. Monochrome is obviously black and white. Portrait will bring out the skin tones, and landscape will bring out the greens and the blues in the sky. Now these are very personal. Personally, I've never used them. When I used to shoot JPEGs briefly, I always left it in standard. It's up to you. The best option is just to play around with them and see which you prefer. What you can also do with these is go into adjust, and you can actually adjust each one to suit your sort of whatever you want. As you can see, you can change the sharpening, the contrast, the brightness, the saturation and the hue. And you've also got quick adjust, or you can quickly just adjust all the settings at the same time. So just play around with them. I mean, set up a scene and then just take images with each setting and see what you prefer, really. Image quality, as you can see, I've got it set on JPEG fine here. That was left over from when I was doing that video. Usually I would shoot in RAW, so I'm going to put that back onto RAW. As you can see, image size greys out when you select RAW, because RAW is a RAW file. It is what it is, you can't change it. It's the full size. If I change that back to JPEG fine, obviously I can then go small, medium or large. White balance, I leave this in auto, to be honest, most of the time, because I shoot RAW. I can change it afterwards in post-processing. If you shoot JPEG, and I suggest you learn all the different white balance settings. I'll try and do a video on this sometime, but like I said, I very rarely actually use these because I just shoot in RAW, leave it on auto, and then change it if I need to in Lightroom afterwards. Auto tends to do a pretty good job, really. I've never really had much problem. Any time it kind of messes up is if you're sort of shooting outside on the street at night and you have the horrible orange street lights. That's the only time really I ever need to change it. ISO sensitivity settings, but again you can change the ISO from in this menu here, or you can do like I've done in one of my other videos, you can select to the function button on the front of the camera for easier access. For most general shooting, you probably want to leave it on 100. Auto ISO is a really handy feature, and I should just quickly show you. I won't go into great detail. I think I've mentioned this in another video. If not, I'll do another one separately on it. With auto ISO, you can set the ISO to automatically come on when you hit a certain shutter speed. I've got it set for 1/30th of a second, so as soon as my shutter speed drops down to that, it will automatically increase the ISO to compensate, and you can select how high you want it to go. For many of these settings, I tend to leave on 1600, both on this camera and on my D700. Although on the D700 sometimes I go up to 6400 if I know that it's going to be a really bad light. Active D-lighting. Now this is another setting that's only applicable when you shoot in JPEG. What this does is it kind of increases the dynamic range slightly of the picture. So if you've got an image with lots of shadows, it kind of brings the shadows out a bit. If you click on the question mark button, it'll actually tell you exactly what it does in sort of Nikon's own words. Improves the level of detail in the highlight and the shadow areas under high contrast conditions. So yeah, it basically brings up the shadows a bit and tones down the highlights a bit. When you've got this set, it will actually slow the camera down a little bit when you're shooting sort of bursts of images, so you might want to bear that in mind. It doesn't do a great deal, it doesn't do anything that you can't sort of get back in Lightroom afterwards, so I've always left that as off. Auto distortion control is a very handy setting. All lenses have different characteristics. When you use wider angle lenses, they tend to distort on the edges. So what that setting does is actually tries to correct that distortion in the actual camera itself. Again, you can do this in Lightroom, but if you don't have Lightroom, that's a really good setting to have on. The colour space, I could get into great detail on this, but I won't. Basically, just leave it in sRGB. That's the most sort of common use. If you use Photoshop or Lightroom, you'll want it in sRGB. I could go for ages on that, but I'll just leave it there. Those will be here all day. Noise reduction. When you shoot at higher ISOs, obviously you produce more noise, so you can get the camera to kind of tone that down a bit. Again, this slows the camera down significantly from shot to shot, so I always leave this off because Lightroom or Photoshop do a much better job at getting rid of noise afterwards. The AF area mode in the viewfinder, obviously you can have a single point autofocus, dynamic area or auto area. I've never used auto area, it's frankly rubbish, it never selects what you want it to, so I wouldn't recommend that. Dynamic area kind of activates points as and when something comes in and out of focus, but I tend to use single point AF pretty much all the time. You've got full control over where the camera is focusing. AF assist, that's the little light on the front of the camera that flashes when it's slightly darker, and it sort of puts a beam of light onto the subject so the focus points can latch on. And we have metering. This is your different metering modes. Matrix, center weighted and spot. Matrix is best for all round use. I suggest you start with that. Center weighted puts sort of the bias onto the center of the frame, and spot just chooses a small spot to meter from. If you don't know what metering is, again I can do another whole video on that, but basically it's the light meter in the camera sort of chooses the correct exposure from what you meter. So if you're shooting a black cat in white snow and you pointed the camera at the snow, it would meter for the snow, and it would sort of just mess up the entire reading. Again, if you're shooting sort of a sky, a landscape sky, and you point it at the bright sky, your foreground would be underexposed. You can choose a different metering mode to kind of get the best out of it. Spot metering is really good when you've got sort of really harsh lighting in the subject, like a bird or something, and you want the bird to be exposed and you're not worried about the rest of it. You place the spot over the bird and the bird would be correctly exposed. But yeah, just to start with, just leave it on Matrix. That takes samples from several hundred different areas all over the frame and sort of combines them to get the best overall exposure. Movie settings, obviously this camera does movie, which I don't use a great deal only for these videos. I tend to just leave it on the highest setting. Obviously you can record the sound or not. Bear in mind on this camera when you're using autofocus, the internal microphone picks up the noise of the autofocus working. Built-in flash, again you probably want to leave this on TTL. That's through the lens. That basically means the camera meters through the lens and sets up the flash accordingly to the right power. Manual flash you probably won't want to use with the built-in flash very often. Okay, the setup menu basically sets up the camera for sort of personal preferences. Again, you can reset it all back to default. First one is format the memory card. I recommend that you do this every time before shoot. Make sure you've taken the images off the card before you do this though. LCD brightness obviously is the brightness of the LCD screen, which you can change up or down. Beware when you change this because it will make the photographs you take look brighter or darker, but in actual fact they won't be, so make sure you always check your histogram as well. Info display, you have the sort of classic, just the numbers, and you can change the colour, or you can have the graphic. This is when you click the info, you can see that's the classic. We can go back to graphic, and you see it's got the icons and everything there. Auto info display, when you press the shutter down halfway the info screen automatically comes on.